Lunch was, again, provided by the Birchwood Cafe, and they are a local restaurant. You might want to consider visiting them.
Yay, Birchwood.
Here, go Birchwood. So before we get started with the panel, I want to, first of all, just acknowledge two people that were absolutely instrumental in making this symposium happen, and that is the grants coordinator, communications person, Hannah Germain. Hannah, would you please stand up? Without Hannah, this literally wouldn't happen. And then Jared Walho. Jared, are you here? There he is. The tallest person in the office. That's Jared. Those two people absolutely crucial to making this symposium happen. Okay, so we're going to have questions for our esteemed panel now, and we have been given a number of different questions. So I will ask questions. I only came across one that was specific for a person, and that was for Karen, and we'll get to that one. But so I'll throw out the question, and then whoever is so inspired can make an attempt to answer it. And we'll see what happens. Okay. Trying to decide where to start here. Okay, so I'll start with this one. Are there ways we can reduce the environmental impact of meat through permaculture design, like hydrophobic designs for raising fish?
Hydroponic design.
What? Yeah, that's what I meant to say. I'm sorry, I slurred my word. Hydroponic designs. So that's a fairly specific question, but anybody want to make a stab at that? Do you think hydroponics are an answer?
Well, I would just say that I think maybe a parallel to a permaculture design is part of the grass-fed approach to raising livestock, or at least more growing the crops that you feed them with more diversity. So whether fish eat grain in a hydroponic system, that grain ought to be produced with more cover crops and continuous living cover in the land. So that's getting closer to permaculture. That's one thing I would say.
I think another aspect of this too is that if you're doing indoor farming, a large portion of the emissions are going to be from energy sourcing. And so if you source it from coal-based power or non-renewable sources, it's going to have high greenhouse gas impacts just because of that. But if you source it from something that's less impact, that also make a difference.
Very good. Okay, now here's a non-controversial question. GMO crops are often promoted as a way to improve sustainability and environmental issues as well as human health. What are your opinions on GM crops? Do you believe they have the potential for these benefits, and are they worth it? So, nice easy question to answer.
Well,
go ahead, George.
I'll dive in. Here's what I would say about the GMO crops that we've seen. So I'm not talking about the universe of what you could do with GMOs or genetic modification in that way, but in terms of what we've seen for Roundup ready kinds of crops and so forth, herbicide reduction and to some degree pesticide production. That technology has enabled more monocultural corn and soybeans in the land, and it's tied farmers onto the technological treadmill. So we've seen the effects of that. More corn, soybeans, more runoff. We're seeing that it was predictable that when you spray an herbicide like Roundup, even though it was thought to be a pretty good pesticide or herbicide, when you spray it ubiquitously, you're going to get weed resistance. I mean, it's a given. It's a very high probability. That was totally predictable. It's happening. So now we're going back to some of the old chemicals that we tried to get away from using that. So the GMOs, the way they've been done on the landscape in American agriculture, haven't worked the way that they were intended. They worked for a little while to reduce pesticide use, and now they're not working for that anymore. The system's breaking down in that regard. So the way we've used them has not been productive. It's tied farmers onto a technological treadmill and has been harmful to the environment in total, is what I would say.
I can expand on that too. I think it's more of a case-by-case basis than GMOs are good or bad. It's going to the Roundup example that George gave, is that in the case of Roundup-ready corn or soybean or other Roundup-ready crops, its total herbicide applications have actually increased after adoption of Roundup because you can apply a single thing that's relatively cheap. So in that case, for herbicide applications, it probably has not been that good for the environment, and probably not that great for health either. At the other extreme for, say, cotton production in the US, a lot of cotton production is GMO for, it's called BT cotton. It's to be protective against a rootworm, which is a cotton pest. And so the way that has worked is that the cotton plant now produces the pesticide that they would have instead been applying to the cotton. And so that GMO crop has actually reduced pesticide applications. And so you can't really say everything is good or GMOs are always good or always bad. It's very context dependent on what you're trying to do with it and how it actually ends up working in the field.
Go ahead, Dave. All of the examples that have been talked about are, in theory, benefits for the farmer. In reality, they've been benefits for the companies that develop the GMOs and the chemicals used in those systems. There's only been one crop developed for consumer benefit, and that's golden rice. Golden rice has high levels of beta-carotene converted to vitamin A. Vitamin A is one of the most prevalent deficiencies in the world. There are literally millions of people blind in the world as a result of vitamin A deficiency. And because of the fear of GMOs, it's not been adopted in many countries, and many countries won't even allow it to be grown. Test plots have been dug up in several countries just to test golden rice. And so, you know, the people who developed that decided not to patent it. It's freely available to anybody who wants to try it. And yet it's not being used anywhere, despite the fact that we have millions of blind people as a result of vitamin A deficiency. So, as Mike said, it's case by case that you need to test both benefit and potential harms from GMO crops.
Okay, thank you. So here's another question. How can people with lower income overcome the obstacle of organic foods being more expensive than inorganic foods if they want to be vegetarians or vegans?
Two ways, I guess. Well, one, mainly, if you're eating organic, it probably means that you're eating less meat than what you would be otherwise. And meat products are generally more expensive than plant-based foods. That doesn't really get to the answer that you're probably hoping for, but it's one way of looking at it.
Also depends on your motivation for eating organic food. If you're trying to avoid artificial chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, things like that, the USDA analyzes roughly 14,000 foods a year for pesticide residues. And the majority of fruits and vegetables, which are the bulk of the products tested, have no pesticide residues detectable in them. And of all of these 14,000 plus analyses, less than 1% actually have levels of residues that are considered of concern to either EPA, USDA, or FDA. So from a health perspective, there isn't a huge difference between conventionally grown produce and organically grown produce.
Well, I want to thank you for that comment, David, because then as a public health person, our concern is really, I think, especially since the question was framed from the perspective of a population that's low income and perhaps marginalized and who don't have access to even fresh produce, let alone if it's organic or not organic. So I think just to deviate a little bit and from the perspective of health and to improve the overall healthy lifestyle of people, I think the real question is, how can we get the people who are in the lower income group to even eat more of these vegetables or fresh produce, regardless whether it's organic or not organic. And since now David told us that there's really not a danger with not too much of a danger with the pesticides in these organic foods, and then I think the real question really is, how can we get these populations to eat more healthy in general and to eat more plants?
Can I also respond?
Yes, by all means.
So Land Stewardship Project is a partnership with a group called Hope Community in Minneapolis on the corner of Portland and Franklin. So it's a very low-income community. What we've done together there is to look at gardening, reintroducing people to gardening, and then cooking with the materials that come out of the garden. So as a community activity. And that's helped reintroduce people to the value of those kinds of foods and what to do with them in a way that fits their cultural backgrounds, because there's multiple cultures in that, living in that particular community. So I think that's one thing. I think, ultimately, it's not a near-term solution, but, better paying jobs affords people the ability to buy the food that they want. Now, there's people who can afford to pay more for food who don't want to also. So we have, that's another question, because one of the things we can't do, I think, is we pursued a cheap food policy in this country. And so we can't put that on the backs of farmers if they're investing more time and energy to grow things, maybe not quite as productive, maybe or maybe not. We can't put that on the backs of farmers, but we still have to deal with the thorny social problem that if people don't have enough money to buy healthier food, we need to deal with that at the same time. So I don't think there are easy answers to that.
So here's someone asking for some specific help. The question is, from growing up on a family farm and ranch of 150 cow-calf pairs and growing wheat, soybeans, and corn, how can we help with being more environmentally conscious, yet practical for farmers without downsizing and losing money? So what advice would you give to this person?
That's a great question, and to be frankly honest, I have no idea.
Honesty.
So I'm guilty of this too. Most people that look at food system sustainability are also guilty of this. People will, if you're taking global perspective or perspective in the US, most people will say, don't eat as much meat, don't eat as much dairy or eggs. You sometimes get people talking about the health impacts or potential health benefits of that. You sometimes get people talking about the cultural aspect of meat consumption that might be relevant to certain communities. Almost never do you get people talking about what the economic impact on the ag producers will be. And so that's really a very unanswered question at this point in terms of what's going to happen and what can you do to make that not happen.
So I would say we've held maybe 6 or 8 seminars in soil health this winter, workshops featuring farmers who are doing it, folks like Ray Archuleta, who used to be with the Natural Resources Conservation Services and is on his own now, talking about the profitability of that. So, I mean, I don't know the system, whoever asked that question exactly that you have, but for example, cover crops work well following wheat because it's a short season. We have a cropping systems calculator that can help compare the cost of a corn-soybean rotation to adding in wheat, adding in cover crops, to shifting grazing from continuous grazing to various forms of managed rotational grazing. So that might be an option. But, I mean, if you've got wheat in your system, you're on the way, it seems to me, to a profitable system, reducing the need for off-farm inputs, to not necessarily getting rid of them, but reducing the need by using cover crops and by grazing those cover crops, and then using those in corn and soybeans as well, and grazing that using the kind of fencing technology that's available today. So just a couple of thoughts about that.
Good. So here's a nutritional epidemiology question. So this one is actually for Karen. but anyone else can pipe in as well. According to your data showing what each group was eating, the non-vegetarians consumed more junk food than any other diet group. Thus, is it accurate to draw the overall conclusion that vegetarianism lowers risk of cancer when the consumption of junk food has not been controlled for?
Oh, that's a very good question. And we will consider that next time. No, but that's a very good question to ask, and we have what we've done in place of that is to adjust for energy intake, because a lot of this junk food actually are high in calories, and so that is how we've been handling it in our analysis this time. And but that's an excellent suggestion, and I will consider that in our future analysis.
So I'll add that Seventh-day Adventists are Americans in general, so they don't eat dramatically differently other than the vegetarian aspect from the rest of the population. And one of the real changes in American food intake patterns in the last 30 years has been huge increase in snacking. And snacks can be candy, Twinkies, or an apple. It's usually not an apple, though. A third of our calories in the United States now comes from snacks, not from meals. And so we're getting a high percentage from nutrient-poor foods that just provide empty calories. And this is a problem in any observational epidemiology study, not just for the Seventh-day Adventist cohorts. Every cohort has changed. The Harvard epidemiologists at least administer their questionnaires every several years. None of the other large cohorts do repeated questionnaires. They take a baseline survey, and then they make believe nothing's changed for the 20 years of follow-up. And that's patently untrue. But that's what we're basing a lot of our decisions on, diets from 20 years ago, which had fewer calories from snacking and a different distribution of where those calories came from.
And so on that point where the Harvard group, they're able to assess the diet every 2 years. And so in the Adventist health study, we've now had many years of follow-up, but we only have a baseline dietary assessment. And it's true, we really wish we could have, but this is a very expensive endeavor. And the Harvard group has more resources to be able to do this every 2 years. So then going back to the original question, I've now had enough time to think about a proper response. And so, you know, if we were also to adjust for, let's say, if we were to adjust for these other foods that are considered bad, like the sweets and all of this, the problem with adjusting for that is we could have a potential multicollinearity issue, so that when that happens, then your main exposure, say, and that other food like sweets, for example, might be actually correlated with your main exposure. And so then what that means, it's really measuring the two variables, although they're different, they're actually measuring the same thing. So one might actually be a marker for the consumption of a particular kind of diet or another kind of food. So that would be something that we do before we even start adjusting for all these other variables.
Okay, good. Now, I'd like to open it up to anyone here. We have Hannah with a microphone, so if anything in the discussion has prompted a question, just raise your hand and Hannah will come over to you with a microphone.
I'm wondering if you could elaborate on what it is that you want to see different about the Farm Bill in Minnesota?
Well, within the crop insurance provision, which is one of just one title of the kind of very complicated farm bill, we would like to see caps on how much public support would go toward that. Right now, it's not capped, unlike most of the other farm bill conservation programs that have caps in terms of how much money the government will spend. The government subsidizes insurance companies for the cost of this insurance. That's another consideration. They lobby for that, of course. And then sometimes the crop insurance, it's complicated and it depends, but sometimes they're reluctant to pay for, say, planting into a green cover crop, because their assumption there is that it will take the water away from the existing crop and therefore cause a reduction in yield that shouldn't have to be paid for through the insurance. That may be true in some cases, not always true. We've lobbied for changes in how much cover crop seeding rates need to be included and so forth. So but caps would be a big thing. Allowing these conservation cropping system rotations to be included would be another. We also would like to see the Conservation Security Program continued. That's under threat. We'd like to see the EQIP program, Environmental Quality Incentives Program. It's another conservation program that cost shares changes for farmers. A lot of that money has gone toward these CAFOs, large-scale CAFOs. We just think that if people want to build those, they should do that. They're on their own. We don't have to publicly subsidize that. Let's get more continuous cover on the ground. Let's get some of these animals out of those CAFOs and onto the ground. Those are a few things that we'd like to see. Some issues in competition as well, and support for beginning farmer training programs. Yes. Yeah, you can find it on our website. And if you come to the Family Farm Breakfast next week at the state capitol, we might tell you a little bit about that too, even though it's state, not federal. Next Thursday, I think it is, the 14th.
Any other questions from the audience that someone would like to ask?
I've got one.
Go ahead, Steve.
Are y'all aware of anyone that's gone like the walls of thermodynamic route relative to hydroponic versus conventional cropping? Because we've got to make all the plastic, we've got to mine the water, we've got to deliver, we've got vehicles involved, and so like the total environmental cost of hydroponic versus crop production. Just to really reiterate that it's not the solution to grow vegetables in a box. Is my agenda. But are y'all aware of any studies that has gone that deep instead of, because I hear in hydroponics all the time that they use a fraction of the water.
I can try to answer that question.
Opinions are too.
Yeah, so I don't know specifically of hydroponics or aquaponics in terms of the impacts of that.
One of the same.
Fair enough. So I'll talk about 2 points. The data I showed earlier today also accounts for the impacts of producing the machinery. So those are already included in what I showed before. The other system that I think is maybe not directly comparable, but somewhat comparable, is producing foods in greenhouses. It's indoors, it's very artificial, for lack of a better term, is that greenhouses can be incredibly efficient in terms of fertilizer use, water runoff, water use. They can be very productive per land area, so they can have very high crop yields. I would not be surprised if you see similar things with aquaponics or hydroponics, just because you can kind of leverage the same exact efficiencies by growing food all year round, by growing crops in multiple layers or vertically as opposed to horizontally.
I mean, there's a related technology called high tunnels, which is used in these parts some, which is not necessarily a greenhouse, but it's covering covering the system so you don't go all year round necessarily, but extend it, start earlier, go later into the winter. So that can be beneficial. My 2 cents about hydroponics is I think it can be, it might be helpful to have it as part of our diets, but I don't think we know everything we're getting from soil, and especially healthy soil. So I just think we don't know that yet. We don't know everything we need to add in for the majority of our diet. That would be my question.
So the USDA National Agricultural Library has a division that's called something like Life Cycle Data Commons. And this is the problem in addressing your question, that when you compare different studies, nobody accounts for the same factors. So they're not speaking the same language. Your question is really a target that everybody in this field should be working towards, but I don't think we have data to answer that at this point.
So I think there was a question up in the back.
Question is specifically for Mike. I wanted to know about those graphics that you were using about caloric consumption around the globe and the distribution of them. So just from pure curiosity, were the calories being determined, or any of those macronutrients or food distributions, are those being determined by purchasing or through dietary analysis?
Neither. They're reported by the government, so it's based on what the country has access to, then they allocate it to each person. So they don't give distributions between high income and low income or urban and non-urban areas.
So it's purely on production and imports.
And what's used for feed or processed into soaps or oils and so on.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Yep.
And then we probably just have time for maybe one more question.
Right.
Hi. Ooh, that's loud. So I'm going to tee up this question just a little bit because I want to tie it back to Tamara's opening about changing our minds. To me, in the meat or no meat question, the thing that often rises to the top of my priority list is this question of animal welfare. And within the last year, I changed my mind. I thought that it was impossible to have an ethical food system where animals are killed. And in the last year, I changed my mind and now think that it is possible, though not without challenge, to have a food system that produces meat in a way that is protective of animal welfare, as a part of having lots of conversations with farmers over the past year. So my question to the panel is this question of, if meat is healthy to eat and if we can raise it sustainably in a way that's mindful of the environment, what changes do you think need to be made, and what is in the power of the people sitting in this room to do to help in those changes to make sure that the future of meat is also one that is protective of animal welfare?
All right, well, I'll take a start then.
Brave man, George.
I think animals do need to be allowed to express their behaviors. I mean, there's whatever behaviors are part of their life. So that slide I showed of the hogs outside, for example, is an example of that. Now, is every hog going to be outside all the time? No. But hoop house production still allows them to do that more than a caged, penned situation does. You know, that's a big debate around chickens right now and how they're raised. Should they be caged or not? You know, a lot of pushback from the ag industry about that'll bankrupt us and cost way too much. Maybe it will cost more. Maybe it should cost more. That's not easy for the farmer to take on the chin. So, you know, we're going to need to help them adjust if that's what we want. But I think my advice to the audience is that as you look into it, talk to whoever you buy your meats from, be it the grocery store or direct from a farmer about that, and tell them what your concerns are, what you want, what you're looking for. That makes change. That's what drives change in the food industry. The other thing I would say is there's a person named Temple Grandin who's done a lot of work on how to humanely lead animals to slaughter, for example, that doesn't, as humanely as possible. No animal wants to be killed, of course, just like we don't want to be, but nevertheless, there's more humane ways to do that. So I think some places are adopting those kinds of standards pretty much more widely than they used to, for example. So I think it can be, we can do that. We're doing it already in some cases, can do more.
What was that person's name?
Temple Grandin. She's, you can find her, there's probably a YouTube video about her, I think. I'm pretty sure there is. She's interesting. She's on the spectrum, and that has enabled her to sort of understand what animals see from a little bit from their perspective.
So tying it back to another earlier question too is that so George spoke about this earlier, is that we subsidize a lot of livestock production by making the price of maize and soybeans cheaper than what they would be. And so looking at it from that front, if we don't subsidize livestock production, the cost of meat would probably increase. I don't know how much it would, but it would probably increase. And from that perspective, people would probably start consuming less meat to an extent. Taking it to the ethical aspect of it, I think it's, in terms of CAFOs and concentrated feeding operations, I think it's somewhat not debatable, hesitantly, somewhat not debatable that those operations are maybe not the most ethical practices to have, and that more ethical practices are generally either smaller scale or have a lot more land per cow or per chicken or pig than what those operations do have. And so in both of those perspectives, it's probably tied a lot to how much meat we consume, because how much meat we consume is also influences how that meat can or has to be produced in some cases.
Well, it's been a fascinating discussion. I think we could probably go on for a long time, but we have more to come in terms of speakers, and so we should move on. So join me in thanking the panel members. Thank you, guys.